set up a surprise birthday party for my husband, but he arrived with his work wife, openly acknowledged their affair, called our marriage a mistake, in front of everybody. For as long as I can remember, my husband has always expressed to me how meaningful turning 40 would be for him. His father passed away at the young age of 39, so he had just one particular wish: to live longer than his father did. So, when his 40th birthday was approaching, I started thinking about how special it would be to organize a surprise party for him. It felt like the perfect moment to mark the occasion in a big, joyful way. I wanted to plan a celebration where he could be surrounded by the people who loved him the most, his closest family and friends. So, I went all out during the planning process. I wanted everything to be perfect, from the guest list to the decorations, and I even extended a special invitation to my mother-in-law, Cheryl. Cheryl and I have always had a close relationship, and I knew how much it would mean to my husband to have his mom there for this occasion. She lives out of town, so I made sure to book a flight for her to arrive on the day of the party. Everything was coming together, and I couldn't wait to see the look on my husband's face when he walked into a room filled with the people who cared about him the most. On the night of my husband's birthday party, everything was in place. The decorations were perfect, the guests were quietly waiting, and the house was dark. We all stood silently, our excitement barely contained, as we waited for him to come home. Earlier that day, I had set the stage without giving anything away. Over breakfast, I had casually mentioned to him that I would be at my parents' house that evening, hoping to keep his expectations low. My goal was for him to think I wasn't planning anything special for his birthday. I imagined how amazed he would be when he walked through the door and discovered the actual surprise waiting for him. When I heard my husband's car pull into the driveway, my heart started racing. I was practically tingling with anticipation. We all stayed perfectly still, listening to the sounds of him outside, his footsteps, the faint jingle of his keys as he fumbled to unlock the door. I giggled to myself, picturing him trying key after key in the dark, probably muttering to himself in frustration. Then, finally, the door swung open. We all jumped up at once, shouting surprise. "Happy birthday," as the lights flickered on. But instead of the joyful expression I had been eagerly awaiting, there stood my husband, Jackson, his tie loosened, arms wrapped around his coworker, April, in the middle of a kiss. Everyone around us fell silent, and the room, which had been so full of happiness just seconds before, was now thick with shock and disbelief. People gasped in horror, staring at Jackson and April. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. For some context, my husband and April are coworkers. They have been working together for quite a while. She's younger than both of us, and is one of his subordinates at work. Over the years, I've seen her at the annual office Christmas parties when Jackson would bring me along. I've observed how she interacts with people, especially with him. At times, she'd come off a bit flirtatious and would even call herself his work wife, jokingly. But I had never taken it seriously. I would brush it off, mostly because she seemed to behave that way with almost all the older men at the office. I thought this was just part of her personality and never really let her behavior bother me because I trusted my husband and didn't see her as a serious threat. But now, standing in the doorway and seeing Jackson kissing her, it was humiliating in a way I had never imagined. I felt a rush of emotions. When my husband realized that we were all there and staring at him, he finally stopped. His eyes were unfocused, and he seemed drunk, stumbling a bit. He looked around at the people gathered for his surprise party and simply said, "Oops," before bursting into laughter again. Meanwhile, April stood beside him awkwardly, fixing her shirt, her lipstick almost wiped clean because of their kiss. The room was silent, and all I could feel was the crushing weight of embarrassment and hurt. With all eyes on me, waiting for how I'd respond, Cheryl, my mother-in-law, was the first to break the silence. She stood up and demanded loudly, "Jackson, what the hell are you doing?" Jackson's eyes widened, clearly not expecting to see her there. He slowly turned his head toward her and tried to explain in his dazed state, "I didn't expect everyone to be here." He trailed off, looking a little embarrassed now. My heart raced as I confronted him directly, asking why he was with April in our house, kissing her, when I had organized this surprise party to celebrate his birthday. I had to know the answer, even though I was terrified of what he might say next. Jackson sighed and just shook his head. He glanced around the room before clearing his throat in a casual tone, as if making a work announcement. I had planned to break the news another day, he said. Then, with a sneer, he added, but since the surprise party exposed me and April, I might as well reveal the truth now. April and I are together. We've been dating for a few months now. He paused, glancing at her for confirmation before looking back at me, and I'm falling in love with her. I stood there utterly stunned. What was my husband even talking about? My hands were trembling, my heart pounding in my chest as the weight of his words settled in the air.
He didn't just stop, though.
He continued, saying how he had tried to hold off his feelings for April for months, but this year he had realized that he needed to finally start living life on his own terms. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The words felt surreal, like they were coming from someone else, not the man I had spent years building a life with. He then went on this rant about how his father had died young, never getting the chance to fulfill his dreams. I don't want to end up like him, he said, his tone almost defiant. I need to do what makes me happy before it's too late for me. My mouth hung open in disbelief, and I could feel the tears starting to well up in my eyes. It was like he was casting me aside, as if our history didn't even matter. In the heat of the moment, something inside me snapped. I felt furious and betrayed. I grabbed the birthday cake, the same cake I had spent time and care picking out for him, and without thinking, I hurled it at his face. The cake smashed all over his clothes. At first, everyone just gasped in shock, but then some began laughing at his face. Our guests could see just how rude my husband was to humiliate me this way, and I guess they wanted to show their support. Jackson was understandably furious as he wiped his face. His voice, thick with anger, echoed through the room as he screamed at me, "Look what you've done. You've dirted my shirt." It was almost laughable how trivial his complaint was, given the gravity of the situation. Here he was, fixated on the state of his shirt as though that was the most pressing issue, not the fact that he had just humiliated me in front of everyone, flaunting his betrayal. Without sparing me another glance, Jackson stormed off upstairs to probably change, while April stood there unashamedly, looking at everyone. As soon as Jackson was out of sight, I took the opportunity to glare at her. I then marched over to her, grabbed her by the hair, and dragged her outside. Her shrill protests filled the air, accusing me of manhandling her, but not a single guest came to her aid. No one moved, no one even batted an eye. Even Cheryl was furiously shouting at April for having the sheer audacity to try to sleep with Jackson under my own roof, at our party, in front of our friends. Once outside, I spun her around and let out the words I had been holding in, like venom on my tongue. "I just can't believe you," I said. "You slept with my husband after all the times you've seen me at this party, after you've seen us together for so many years." The disbelief, the hurt, it all came pouring out. But April wasn't fazed. She wasn't even ashamed. She just scoffed, her lips curling into a smug, defiant smirk as if I were the one in the wrong. With disdain in her voice, she declared that Jackson wanted her and that I had no right to stand between them. She added that he was going to leave me one day anyway. Her words felt like knives slicing through me. She continued, "Instead of placing blame on me, maybe you should reflect on why you failed as a wife," suggesting that my inability to keep him satisfied was the reason he had turned to her. Every word, she said, pushed me closer to the edge. My mind could barely process the nerve of this woman. She taunted me further, telling me how I didn't understand him the way she did, how I didn't make him smile the way she did. "That's why he's leaving you," she sneered. "He deserves someone better than you." Hearing those words, something inside me snapped. I didn't even think. My vision blurred, and the next thing I knew, my hand flew across her face in a slap so hard, it made a sickening sound.